Hello everyone, I'm Jane Hansen, and this week in the arena, mental depression. It's on the rise at an alarming rate among children, adolescents, working adults, the elderly, virtually every segment of the population. And adding to the phenomenon is something that's recently been termed as recession depression, which of course relates to the economic experiences that we've all been having and the kind of dire economic situation that a lot of people are in these days. So joining our discussion today, as usual, Monsignor Kieran Harrington, who is the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn. And then today we have our special guest, Dr. Allison Hinds, who is a psychiatrist with Catholic Health Services of Long Island and has her own private practice. Also joining us today, Dr. Andrew Vidich, the author, educator, international speaker, former college professor, current high school teacher, founder and CEO of the Leadership Institute, who just authored his third book. It's called Light Upon Light, and it is 5 Master Paths to Awakening the Mindful Self. So welcome to all of you. Let's start with you, Dr. Hinds. What is it that is causing depression to be on the rise?
Well, it's an interesting perception that depression is actually on the rise. Some of the studies they did in the 80s, they think might be flawed in that they underestimated the amount of depression there actually is out there. Basically, 1 in 5 of us is going to become depressed in our lifetime. And for women, the rate is higher than for men, almost twice as high.
So are you saying that the reality is we are not any more depressed than we've always been? It's just that we're now paying more attention to it?
It's hard to know. There are a lot of different opinions on that. But certainly the good news is that there's much more awareness out there nowadays.
And probably less stigmatized too.
Much less stigma. The celebrities are coming forth and telling us about their mood disorders, their depression, allowing a lot more people to have the courage to come forth and really get help for themselves. So there's much more awareness.
Dr. Vidich, you work a lot with young people, and of course there's a great deal of concern about teenagers and young adults, college students, having more depression than in the past. Do you see that?
Anecdotally, I don't see any big changes. I do see some different conditions arising which may cause, a seemingly increase in one area or another. But I don't really have the statistics to say whether or not it's actually on the rise or not. I think someone more qualified might be able to do that. I do see anecdotally from my own experiences that the same basic issues, though, that we have seen always continue to arise.
Do you see perhaps in like a fracturing of society, that especially as we enter an age which is much more dependent on technology and an age where everyone is so much more connected to one another through electronic means, that somehow what this is fostering is almost a sort of a narcissism where people are very focused upon themselves, and this is kind of intensifying this sense of isolation that they have from one another. And could that be driving this phenomenon we're seeing?
Yes, there is a lot of talk about people becoming more self-centered, more narcissistic, and certainly becoming more socially isolated. Teens are on their computers all day, they're on their cell phones texting each other, they're hardly looking at one another, they're not connecting person to person anymore. And certainly social isolation is bad for depression and for anxiety as well, and for social anxiety. If you're texting someone, you're not looking at them, you're not even hearing their voice, to hear the tone of voice, the vocal inflection. So certainly, yes, there are ways of maybe putting a little smile on your text message, but it's hard to convey emotion.
Less authentic in some sense, in terms of it doesn't, it's not real. Even though there may be this conversation taking place, it's almost one-dimensional. It's almost a conversation that one is taking place with oneself.
Right, exactly. And there's lots of room for misinterpretation too of what somebody says. So let's talk a little bit then about specific things that may trigger depression. Can either one of you address that?
Getting a mortgage, foreclosure on one's house, having trouble with the boss, fighting with one's spouse, any of those things really can trigger depression because they are stressful events.
What should you do?
Anything can trigger depression. It's a question of what resources do you have within you to deal with that depression. So no, we're not eliminating all of the stress, and it's how we deal with the stress that either makes you a healthy individual or not a healthy individual. And so do you have the resources at your command to be able to deal in a healthy way with those. So instead of making it a stressful situation, you turn it into a positive, life-affirming situation. And that's the key, I think, to being mentally healthy.
Monsignor, in your practice as the priestly part of your duties, the pastoral duties, you must see more and more that people are coming to you, though, with maybe greater issues or issues that are triggered more easily.
I think that, in my experience, I think that some things that happen for folks is that they don't know why they're depressed. So they can't point to a life event that's taking place. They just feel they're depressed. They feel somehow they have the blues. And you know, part of it, I think, is that we all have the blues sometimes. How do we know that when I just have the blues, or that there is a clinical situation that has developed? I think that that's a big challenge. I also think that one of the big concerns that that starts to develop is this is not an area which is an exact science, right? And we're in a place where people want an exact answer.
With your heart, you have a test and it tells you what's wrong with it.
Yes, absolutely.
So then how do you know that you really have depression or don't have depression? Is there an absolute answer?
Well, there's not an absolute test out there, but what we do have is a list of symptoms. Sadness, a lack of interest, not enjoying things as much as you used to, an excessive sense of guilt, low energy levels, poor concentration, change in your appetite, either a lower appetite or eating more, changes in your sleep, meaning perhaps you can't fall asleep, you can't stay asleep, you wake up during the night, you can't fall back asleep, you beat the alarm clock, you're awake before it, and then basically you can't get yourself out of bed. But some people can also sleep longer. We have a fancy name for that. We call that hypersomnia. And then suicidal thoughts can also happen.
Don't you always have a sense of guilt? I'm just sure talking
Well, you know,
about
it's interesting you say,
depressions.
because I think that people always attack the Catholic Church and say, you know, we instill guilt in people. I think that one of the things that's happening today is the coarsening of conscience, that people really don't have any sense of guilt, that right or wrong has gone so out the window. And this is part of, I think, also comes to the point of depression, anxiety, lack of direction, because those basic markers that were a part of all of our relationship are gone now. And so it is, what we really are subjected to is, you know, John Paul Sartre spoke about hell as other people, that what we're really subjected to is not objective standards of right and wrong, but really what other people think of us. And so we're always so concerned about how we're being perceived by other people that we become a prisoner. And so that would be my thought in terms of what's happening in our world today.
I wanted to comment on it because I think you're hitting the mark very, very truly. I think we need a new definition of health. I think we have to understand that the health of the body and the mind both depend upon the health of consciousness or spirit. And that this is the big paradigm shift that I think actually as a society and as a country and as a world that we need to go through. That until we understand that the health of the body and the mind both really are dependent upon this consciousness, this force that is within us, we're going to miss the mark. And our answers to questions of guilt, which arise, I think, out of that essential disconnection, which is, for me, that's the definition of depression.
Well, one of the things that that strikes me when you read about the way things used to be when we were first a civilization, we were really out there every day getting satisfaction by finding enough berries or things to eat and by reproducing. And now we're not hungry or dirty anymore. We have a lot of, for the most part, we have all of those needs satisfied, and we have this very elevated expectation of ourselves and what we'll accomplish, and when we can't do that, we become depressed. Is that somewhat fair to say?
Setting standards that are much too high are going to lead someone to feel poorly about themselves. Look at the body image problem with young women. Less than 1% of the female population is going to look like Naomi Campbell. And yet every teenage girl out there, little girls are out there on diets, they've got these unreasonable expectations. And
you can just see that cycle. So we want to talk a little bit about treatments and what to do about it, how to recognize it, how to help somebody, how to help yourself. We're going to do that in just a moment. We're going to take a break, and we want to remind you that you can weigh in on our discussion anytime by going to our website, which is netny.net/in-the-arena, and click on the Enter the Arena icon. We'll be right back in just a moment. back as we continue our discussion about depression and how we can deal with it. And I want to welcome back our guests, Dr. Allison Hinds, who is a psychiatrist with Catholic Services of Long Island and has her own private practice. And then we have Dr. Andrew Vidich, who is an author, the CEO of the Leadership Institute, and whose most recent book is called Light Upon Light, 5 Master Paths to Awakening the Mindful Self. And of course, Monsignor Harrington is here. So we've been talking a lot about symptoms and depression and where it stems from, but the bottom line is, how do you deal with it when you think you have it or when somebody that's very close to you does? Dr. Hinds?
And people should know if they're seeking help for depression, there is not the stigma that there used to be, and things will be held confidential. Someone can seek help from a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker. I'm a psychiatrist, so that means I'm able to prescribe medication.
How often do you prescribe it?
I prescribe medication quite frequently as the years go on in my practice. I see
Why?
more and more.
I mean, why the increase?
As I've got more experience, I've seen how the antidepressants can really make the therapy proceed more quickly. People get better more quickly, has been my experience.
But what is it that the drugs do, the medication does? I mean, is it because there's a chemical imbalance that they're able to write?
Well, the major theories about depression are certainly involving a chemical imbalance in the brain. Taking the medication, you would restore that balance so that people can get back to feeling like themselves again. The medications have very few side effects nowadays. It's not like 25, 30 years ago where the antidepressants had a lot of medication side effects and weight gain. These are very safe medications with low side effects.
Dr. Vidich, do you believe that medication is the way to go?
I wouldn't answer that question. I would put it in another way. I would say that, as I had spoken to you earlier, that in conjunction with other forms of healing modalities is really the best way to go. And the reason I say that is that there's a tremendous amount of studies right now that indicate that, for example, meditation and other kinds of activities can actually generate and actually augment the healing process. And the actual practice of meditation, for example, actually does change the chemical structure of your brain.
Really?
So in effect, it is doing what the pharmaceuticals are doing, but doing it on your own. Now here's the difference. There's a couple of good things. One, it's free. And that's a big one. Because what about all the people who can't afford pharmaceuticals, or there are health issues regarding reactions to that? Two, it's available all the time. All right, this is a technology and a science that's available all the time. The ironic thing is most people who come to the meditation classes I have been referred by a psychologist who themselves are practicing. So there's a whole field of medicine now which is now burgeoning. And on my website, I give the top 10 actual studies on meditation. These are very hardcore studies that have been published in medical magazines and so on and so forth. So the science is there. But we never say do everything and try to exclude, because again, there are things that modern medicine can do that other things can't do. And we recommend that you look at the thing in a holistic perspective and try to address all aspects of the situation in a holistic way. Look long term, but address all aspects.
You were talking about reframing and the suffering. Explain that.
I think I may sound almost out of the main sometimes, but I kind of look at the circumstances of my own life, right, as really opportunities for a different encounter. In other words, that if I'm suffering in this way, if I'm feeling sad, if I'm feeling lonely, if I'm feeling isolated, that somehow, from a from my perspective, my faith perspective, where is God calling me at that moment? That somehow that this is an opportunity for me. That suffering is not something always to be avoided. That I remember as a kid, you're so attracted to the fire, and I remember my mother bringing my hand close to the fire and said, "Don't touch it because your hand is going to get burned." That somehow these emotions we have, or these feelings we have, are reflective of other things that are going on in our life. And so maybe it's not necessary always to say, I got to do away with the symptom of what's happening, but I have to look at some of the underlying things that are happening in my life to kind of, to get better. And I think that is that's a challenge for all of us as well.
But if you're talking about depression specifically there, I don't know if anyone is capable of completely, if you're truly depressed, of doing that without some kind of help. I mean, can you or can you not?
Well, maybe if you can't get up in the morning and you can't get out of bed, that's a different level of depression, right? But,
Yes.
but a lot of us get up every day and we go to work and we feel, we don't want to go on anymore. We feel sad, we feel lonely, we feel isolated. I mean, these are feelings. So there are different levels. I think there are different degrees that we have to consider here.
There's certainly different degrees of depression, and certainly many depressed people don't have any insight into the fact that they're depressed. That's actually worse when they can't admit they're depressed. And depressed people are in a lot of pain. The pain can be almost so great that they start having suicidal thoughts because they want to put an end to this unbearable pain that they're feeling. And that's kind of where the antidepressants come in, the psychotherapy comes in. We say shared sorrow is half the sorrow, shared joy is double joy. And when you go to a psychotherapist, you're confidentially talking to someone, you're sharing your sorrow, you're sharing your joy. You're getting the opportunity that someone understands you and can help you through this pain that you're experiencing.
We have a lot of parents that are watching this program, and I'm wondering if there's something that you can do as a parent for a child when the child is really tiny and as you're bringing them up that will help them be able to not become depressed, to not become the victim of this disease.
Well, I don't know that there's a specific answer to that, really. Certain people are probably going to be more vulnerable to depression, meaning not being quite as able to handle stress as well. Certainly teaching children how to cope with stress, how to deal with stress, that if they make a mistake, it's not the end of the world, not fostering too much this sense of perfectionism in their children, teaching resilience, teaching them to be able to bounce back. I think those would all be good things.
It's interesting you say that because I think about recently, there's been a lot of talk about Tiger Mom. And a woman who has really instilled great sense of discipline in her children, desire to succeed, and one of the questions is that the kid makes a birthday card for her, and the mother throws it back and says, "This is not acceptable to me."
I can't imagine doing that.
Well, it's interesting because this is someone who's been on all the talk shows.
Sure, no,
right?
I understand that, but I just can't, as a mother, I just can't imagine doing that. So,
but it's interesting that this is entering into the national consciousness of like how do we and I think what you said about children, which is so important, is children have not developed the coping mechanisms yet, right? They haven't learned the mechanisms, and so they're in a much more fragile state. I mean, as you get older, you kind of learn how you're going to deal with these things. Kids don't have those mechanisms to do such.
Well, Dr. Vidich, you've got like 5 simple steps that can kind of start this process of feeling good about yourself.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those. And basically, they have to do with communication. They have to do with community. They have to do with communion. Those are the 3. And they start with the process. And I want to go back to a question, that's something that you raised, which I think is very important. A lot of times we're looking for push-button answers in our society. The problem with the push-button answer, or the quick answer, is it doesn't allow the process of the heavy lifting and the deep insight to arise. And I believe that that many of the issues both teens and adults are dealing with is because we're not looking at the problem and actually addressing the problem. We're just masking the symptom. And this is, I think, what you were addressing before. So I think that while we need to use all means that we have in order to get at the problem, we ultimately have to go to the source, and I think the source is love. If people are not feeling connected, if they're not getting the kind of love from the beginning, from the moment they're born to the moment they're dying, depression will set in at some point. And young adults now, and this has to do with the cyberbullying, are feeling disconnected because they don't have the quality relationships that should be developing and the support relationships that should be developing. And that's where this community, communion and communication comes in. Those three elements are so critical.
You know what's interesting is the question of love that you talk about is I think that the problem is people don't know what love is. I mean, love has been based simply in an emotion, an appetite, a feeling, and so therefore it's very arbitrary. I mean, I can love now, I don't love tomorrow, and I think that is really a difficulty in this process. People don't have the experience of being loved because they don't know what love is. They don't know how to love.
And last words from you, because I know we've got to get you out
Well,
of
I would
here.
just say that is the journey, is to find out what love really is. And it is not what our society has made it out to. It's not a like. Yeah. It is something permanent, and it has to do with something that is unconditional, and is given unconditionally, and is always there. And that is the problem, is that much of our love is really here today, gone tomorrow. And I call that more infatuation or lust than really love. Mm-hmm. It's more of a contract or a business deal, all right? And we need to get back to the spiritual source of that love. And I think that's the ultimate, for me, that's the ultimate epidemic, is that we are spiritually amputated beings. And until we deal with that, we're going to continue to have half solutions and not full solutions.
Dr. Vidich, we thank you so much for all of your thoughtful perceptions and everything you've shared with us today. Dr. Hinds, you're going to stick around as we wrap things up here. I do want to remind you that you, too, can join our discussion by simply going online to our website, netny.net/inthearena, and click on the In the Arena icon. We'll be right back. And welcome back to In the Arena as we continue our discussion about depression. And I am joined again by Monsignor Harrington, who is the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn, Dr. Allison Hinds, who is a psychiatrist with Catholic Health Services and has her own private practice, and then our regular contributor, Grant Gallicho, the Associate Editor of Commonweal magazine. And Grant, since you've just joined us, you know, as a journalist, there are certain rules and regulations that we have about how we can cover people who have some sort of a mental illness, including depression, and yet we see its impact. So I'm just curious what you're thinking about this discussion we've had here and relating it to kind of what's going on in the world today.
Yeah, well, I mean, the obvious question that it raises is how do you deal with someone like Jared Loughner, who allegedly shot up all of those people?
In Tucson.
In Tucson. And it sounds like there were certain warning signs. There have been a lot of interviews with friends, teachers who became increasingly concerned that he was a threat. So in response to those news items, some people have started to raise questions about whether our mental health laws are really strict enough. Do we need to go back to a time when it was easier to institutionalize someone who showed violent tendencies?
Or showed that they had some possibilities of a traumatic event. We've already talked earlier about how trauma may trigger depression. So, I mean, what do you think?
I'm not sure exactly what the question
I guess
is.
so if someone comes to you and expresses a desire to do serious harm, what is a doctor's job? What can she do in that situation?
We have a duty to warn the person and notify them that a specific threat has been made against them, or if someone makes any reference to harming the president, obviously. That brings duties with itself as well.
I know that state laws vary, but in New York State, are you required to inform the police if you get that kind of statement from a patient?
I'd have to look that up under the Tarasoff ruling, but you definitely have to warn the other person that there's been a threat to harm them.
But I guess what I'm curious about more than that is frequently, as a journalist, you'll go into a neighborhood after something's happened and you'll have the neighbor say, you know, I thought that guy was a little off. What is our responsibility as human beings to maybe look at someone and say, man, they need some help. How can I help them? Without overstepping our bounds.
I think that there are two things that we have to recognize. First off, we're not going to eliminate people from doing things that are wrong, that are sinful, that are hurtful, that are evil, that are criminal. that's not going to happen, right?
Right.
I mean, we're dealing with original sin. It's part of the human condition. People make mistakes and things happen. So I don't think that should be, I don't even think that should be our goal, is to try to eliminate that. I think that that the big question, what we need to do is we need to foster communion. And it goes back to the same sense that I think that we started with this discussion, that there is a fracturing that seems to really be taking place in society where people are not bound to one another. When you call your bank now, you get an electronic voice. When you do any sort of transaction, it's basically not an interface with another person. And this is really problematic because we really need one another. We're social animals, you know, and social animals, it's the presence, being present to one another, which I think is really critical. And the more technologically advanced we become, the more we're able to downsize and have computers doing jobs of people and that sort of thing. There is a real urgent effort, I think, for one another to kind of to relate with one another. And I think that when you take a look at our society, you see how many marriages are failing, you see how many children don't have parents at home when they come home from school. All of this is symptomatic of a real breakdown in society, which is going to have a cascading and a profound effect for all of us.
And certainly with that sense of disconnectedness, someone's going to become more isolated. It's a big risk factor for depression and other mental illness. And what you mentioned before, if you're only communicating through technology and you're really not communicating directly with the person, how are you going to see that other person as a real person?
It's very difficult. Grant, last thoughts on this whole subject?
I think we need to follow the Pope's advice, which is he recently gave the statement about social networking and said that this is a rich tool, but it carries a real risk of breaking bonds. And I think in the Jared Loughner case, you see that those YouTube videos that he created, that became his primary form of expression. He was expressing himself to a machine and probably counting how many strangers were watching his videos. That's not human. That's just not human.
Right, and he can't humanize the other people because he's connected on that level. It's much easier to harm another person if you're not connected to that person, if you see that person as a machine, as something that's not real.
And that's what's happening, you know, all across our college campuses, as younger people are no longer, I mean, you know, it used to be that people were afraid you send your kid to college, the kid drinks and they're going to be sleeping around. Now you don't have to worry about them drinking and sleeping around. Now they're doing everything via the internet. And it's just becoming
deeply
more and more
depersonalized.
inhuman. Yep.
We thank you all so much for being with us, Grant, Dr. Hinds, Monsignor, and we thank you, of course, for joining us. We invite you to join in our discussion because we'd love to know what you have to think. You can simply go to netny.net/inthearena, and we're there. So we'll see you next time in the arena. Thank you for joining us.